Welcome to Making Wine at Home. Well, now we've reached day 56 on the Chardonnay wine kit that we've been making. We have a carboy that is stunningly clear, filled with beautiful, beautiful Chardonnay that is ready to be filtered. Now, we could go straight to bottling if you wanted to, but I want to make sure that we don't have a wine that throws sediment after a year or two being in the bottle. So what we'll be doing today is we'll be using a filtering process to further polish that wine. We'll filter into another carboy and then we'll let that wine sit for 1 or 2 days before we actually bottle it. And the reason we do that is the filtering process really beats up the wine. So we don't want to bottle it right away. We want to give it time to sort of recover from that filtering process. But another couple of days, then we'll bottle. So I'm looking forward to today's video. This is very exciting. We're getting really close to the end, so I hope you enjoy it as well. It's going to be a shorter video, just going to take you through the filtering process, and then the next video after this will be the final bottling of that wine. So stick with us. Thank you for joining. So the process of filtering is actually pretty easy. The first step I like to go through is I like to take my wine off of the existing lees. So I rack it to another container. You don't have to do that when you filter because the filter device that actually fits into the carboy can be fitted so that it doesn't pick up any of the sediment. I like to rack it first so I have no chance of getting sediment. If you get sediment during the filtering process, it can actually clog up the filter. So during the filtering process, we want to make sure that we're filtering as clean a wine as we can. It'll get it through the filter quickly. Now during the filtering process, you can use different kinds of filters. Now what we're going to talk about today is a filter that I use called Buon Vino. You don't have to buy one of those. You can buy a different kind of filter. I found it very economical and it's easy to use. Now there are 3 kinds of pads that you can use. One pad is really coarse. I don't use those pads very much, if at all. The second pad is one that's used for filtration. Now that pad, they call it pad number 2. That is used for polishing the wine, and it would be perfectly fine to use this pad today. I'm going to use the sterile pad. Now the sterile pad is a little better in the sense that it's a 0.5 micron. It doesn't allow any particulates through. So I mean it's actually going to filter out any bacteria or anything else that's in that wine. Now it doesn't affect the taste of the wine, although I will say it does kind of beat up the wine. So you put some space in between when you filter and when you bottle. So filtering the wine, you'll use a pad of your choice. You'll filter the wine from one carboy to another. It's sort of like racking, but you're using a filter in between. And then what I like to do is I let that wine maybe sit a day. And then the next day I go ahead and bottle with that. That gives the wine kind of a chance to settle down because you really, as I said, you've beaten up that wine pretty badly by pushing it through a 0.5 micron filter. But what you've also done is you've made that wine incredibly clear. And now, because you've passed it through a sterile filter, you have wine that does not, probably will not, should not get any kind of bacterial infection in the bottle, as long as you've done your cleaning and sanitization of your bottles properly. To help you get a better understanding of what I mean by throwing sediment, the picture at the top shows a bottle of wine that has thrown sediment after about 2 years. The one on the bottom is another wine, but that one was filtered and there's no sediment. So you might not see any sediment in the carboy, you might not see anything in the wine itself, but over time, especially a white wine, can throw sediment, and you don't want that to happen if you're going to cellar that wine for any period of time. So filtering your wine is probably a good idea, especially if you think you're going to cellar that wine for more than a year or so. Using a sterile pad, a number 3 pad, is a good idea because that's going to give you the maximum filtration that we can get these days at home. So now that we've discussed the benefits of filtering your wine, we'll go ahead and get started with our Buon Vino mini jet now. It's been 2 days and our wine is very clear. We're going to take a look at that in a moment. But I have chosen to filter this wine now. I typically filter white wines before I'll filter a red wine. Now I do filter both. But when I filter a red wine, I typically use a number 2 filter. Now, the number 2 filter is very good for polishing and clearing out any additional particulates that are in the wine. Remember, you can't filter cloudy wine. If your wine is cloudy, you can't use filtering as a fining process. You have to filter clear wine. But that clear wine could still have some particulates in it that you can't see. It would manifest later as sediment that would be thrown in the wine bottle. So we want to try to get that out if we can, and number 2 pads are perfect for that. For today, since it's a white wine, I want to use a sterile pad. Now the sterile pads are effective because what they do is they filter out anything that cannot get through 0.5 microns, which means any microbial that could possibly be in that wine today is going to get filtered out with this pad. This is why this is called a sterile pad. So let's get started. Before you use your Buon Vino mini jet, you have to go through a few steps. The first step is we will take our filter pads and submerge them in water. Then the next step will be to pass a gallon of clean water through the mini jet. So starting with each pad, put them in the water and you can see that the pad soaks up the water. And the way this works is each of these goes onto the mini jet, and in between is a filter. So we start by putting a filter on. Now notice the filter has a coarse side. Now if you look at the way that the holes are oriented, you'll see that on the top left you have a hole. So you couldn't get this wrong if you tried to. If you turned it this way, the holes wouldn't be right. If you turn it this way, they will be. So if you notice, that's my first pad. Now the other part that you can remember is, see this coarse side? It's pretty coarse, pretty rough. That always faces you. Now I've zoomed in to get a little more detail, because now that you can see how I've been arranging these, I'm going to arrange the last one. Notice top left, bottom, and then the last one that has to go on has both of our spouts. One is the input, it's going to go from here to here, and that's going to be the output. And don't forget, this is very important, you do have to put this that plate on, because when we put the 2 knobs on, it's going to compress all of those together. Now those are getting compressed pretty well. Alright, we're ready to clean our mini jet, and the way we're doing that is we are going to run a gallon of water through the new filter pads that we just put in, and that will sufficiently get any particulates or any dust out of that filter and get it ready for us to filter our wine. Now, we want to turn the pump off before it drains completely. We don't want to run that pump dry. But that has now run some clean water through the pads. We are ready to move to the next stage, which is to run wine through this. So I'm going to start the process, but it's going to be a little loud, so I'm going to attenuate the volume on this track while it's running. Now watch the exit tube. It's easier to see with a red wine than it is a white wine, but pretty soon you're going to see that go a little yellow. And when we do, we're going to then pipe that wine into the carboy. And there we are. Now what we're doing is we're piping that wine into the carboy, and we're starting to get our first bits of wine that's coming out of the reservoir. Now I'm going to capture that. I'm not going to let that go. Right now I'm letting the rest of the water come out, and then I'm going to dump this secondary container out. As you can see, we're about a third of the way through. Now the wine that's being collected in the reservoir here, that wine is filtered, and we're going to save it and add it to the carboy later. We're emptying out the reservoir very nicely. We're going to empty that container in just a moment, so we give we have more room for some of the throw-off filtered wine. As you can see, this is really looking good. Very, very clear, straw-colored wine that's coming through now, so I'm really excited. The mini jet is working flawlessly. I have it sitting on a towel because it tends to want to walk. It creates a lot of vibration, so it's sitting on a towel for a reason. You probably want to do the same thing. Now as we get to the end of the carboy, what I've done here is I've tipped it back so that I could make sure I had a little bit of a gulf in the back of the carboy where I have the ability to pull up the last few drops of the wine. And at this point you can see the wine has gone through. We want to turn that pump off immediately. We don't want it to run dry. Now the leftover that's come out, I've collected, and I'm going to put that into the secondary carboy. So because I don't want anything to happen to the wine at this stage, look at all the work that we've done, I'm going to put a blanket of inert gas down on top of that wine, and I'm going to use private preserve to do it. Just simply insert this into the entry point, and I'm going to just lightly add gas. And what's happening is that's now pushing gas out of the exit, and it's substituting this blanket of inert gas. So there it is. We will let this sit for 2 days before we bottle. That should give the wine sufficient time to calm down after being beaten up by the filter. Wow, to recap, the filtering process really polished up that wine beautifully. Now, you could see you have to go through a few extra steps, getting everything ready to do the filtering, making sure everything's in place, but it's well worth it. That wine, once we have bottled that wine, it can sit on the shelf for 2 years, 3 years, and it will not throw any sediment. This is a beautiful wine, and I'm really excited that we did the filtering today. Now next up, in the next video, we're going to go ahead and complete with bottling. But for this video, I'm really happy that you were able to join us. And one thing before we go, and don't forget, have a glass of wine today, because one day very soon the wine that you have, well, it might actually look this good or better. Cheers.